I will present Kripke's arguments against the description theory of names, both Russell's simple one and the cluster theory of Searle. These arguments are of two types. There are the semantic arguments, which Kripke gives, and then there are also the epistemological arguments, which Kripke gives. And I will begin with the semantic arguments. So the core semantic insight is that there is a difference between the proposition expressed by a sentence containing a proper name and the proposition expressed by an otherwise identical sentence containing a description or a cluster thereof. Now, I'll make one point before going forward, which is that this insight was actually had by Russell. So actually, if you recall Russell's modal arguments, he actually relied on a very similar semantic insight to this. However, Russell had certain epistemic or epistemological reasons which forced him into thinking that most names or ordinary names had to be definite descriptions. However, these semantic insights, which Russell kind of hit on and which Kripke is elaborating, Kripke takes to be decisive against the view that ordinary names are in fact disguised definite descriptions. So the first way in which we establish this insight of a difference between the propositions expressed by these sentences, i.e. on the one hand sentences containing names and on the other sentences containing descriptions, the first way we establish this is by intuitions about the truth conditions, or what is said by sentences. So the proposition expressed by a sentence is true or false in different possible states of affairs or possible worlds, as philosophers say. So I want you to consider what is said, or the proposition expressed, by the following two simple sentences. So first, suppose someone says to you, Aristotle was fond of dogs. So this sentence expresses a certain proposition. It says something. Okay? There's something that it says. When I tell you Aristotle was fond of dogs, I am saying that Aristotle was fond of dogs. Now, in two, consider the following. The last great philosopher of antiquity was fond of dogs. So here as well, in this sentence, there's something said by it. There's a proposition expressed. It has a meaning. Now, furthermore, we can ask whether this meaning, or what is said by either of these sentences, is true or false in various possible states of affairs or possible worlds. So first, in our world, in the actual world, in our reality, both 1 and 2 are true. Okay, so I'm assuming that Aristotle was in fact fond of dogs, and furthermore, that Aristotle was in fact the last great philosopher of antiquity. So assuming those things are true, then these sentences are of course true, that Aristotle was fond of dogs. What that sentence says, the proposition expressed by it, is true when evaluated at our world, because in our world, Aristotle was fond of dogs. Furthermore, with 2, the last great philosopher of antiquity was fond of dogs. We think about who the last great philosopher of antiquity was in our world, which is Aristotle, and then we wonder whether he was fond of dogs, which he was, and so this sentence is true as well. in our world. When we evaluate either of these sentences, the expression, let me repeat. When we evaluate the proposition expressed or what is said by either one or two at our actual world, we see that what they say or the proposition they express is true. But, and this is very important, we can furthermore consider whether what is said by these sentences is true or false at other possible worlds. So in one here, I want you to begin considering another possible way the world might have been. Okay? And in this other way the world might have been, Aristotle did not become a philosopher. So it's completely possible that Aristotle was completely carried away by his study of biology. And he never wrote any philosophy whatsoever. And so I want you to imagine a possible way the world might have been, which we'll call W, this other possibility, in which Aristotle did not become a philosopher. And I want you to note that in this possibility W, basically everything else was the same other than Aristotle not being a philosopher. So, in this world W, Plato, not Aristotle, was the last great philosopher of antiquity. So this is this alternative possibility that we're considering. Now, in 2, I want you to suppose furthermore that in this alternative possibility we're considering, W, that Aristotle is fond of dogs. So Aristotle in W did not become a philosopher. However, he retained his fondness of dogs. But Plato in W is not fond of dogs. Now, the third step of this argument is very crucial, and it relies on our intuition about the truth or falsity of what is said by either of these sentences in this possibility W that we have developed. And, Kripke claims, the proposition expressed by one is true when evaluated at this other possibility W. So when we consider what is said by this sentence, Aristotle was fond of dogs, and we consider whether the proposition expressed by that is true or false at this other possibility W, in which Aristotle did not do any philosophy, so he was different in certain ways, but also retained a fondness of dogs. And in that case, what one says intuitively is true in W. The proposition expressed by one is true in W. Because in W, Aristotle was fond of dogs, regardless of any other differences that Aristotle had in W compared to, say, our world. But now, consider whether what is said by 2 is true or false in W. Is it true in W, this alternative possibility we've constructed, is it true that the last great philosopher of antiquity was fond of dogs? Now, intuitively, Kripke says, what is said by 2 is false in W. So in W, Plato was the last great philosopher of antiquity, and Plato was not fond of dogs. So when we consider whether it's true in W, whether the last great philosopher philosopher of antiquity was fond of dogs, intuitively it's false, because the last great philosopher of antiquity is Plato, NW, and Plato was not fond of dogs. So, step 4. Propositions are supposed to determine their truth or falsity at various possibilities. So that means, just to say that, elaborate on that, a proposition, or what is said by a sentence, is something that determines its truth or falsity at various possible worlds. And that means that the same proposition can't be both true and false at the same possible world. Therefore, since, as established in 3, what is said by 1 is true in W, but what is said by 2 is false in W, these two sentences have different meanings. They say different things, because what they say has to determine a unique truth value at each possibility. And since the meaning of these sentences, 1 and 2, is built up out of the meanings of their parts, and the only difference in their parts is Aristotle versus the last great philosopher of antiquity, we can conclude that the meaning of Aristotle is different than the meaning of the description, the last great philosopher of antiquity. And for that reason, we should suspect that the meaning of Aristotle cannot be captured by the meaning of any particular definite description. Now, and that is the general conclusion which Kripke wants to get. And now let's see a bit more to unpack his arguments. So, in addition to wondering whether what is said by a simple sentence, for instance, 1 or 2, in addition to wondering whether the proposition or what is said by those sentences is true or false at various possibilities, we could also wonder about the truth value of simple sentences, where I use phi to stand for an arbitrary simple sentence. We can wonder about the truth value of sentences where phi is embedded in what is called a modal operator. And the two modal operators that will concern us are necessarily and possibly. So the idea is that you take a simple sentence, phi, then you put necessarily in front of it to form the sentence necessarily phi. Or you can put possibly, the operator possibly, in front of a sentence to say possibly phi. And then you can wonder about the overall truth value of those sentences where we're talking about the necessity of a certain embedded sentence. Okay, so I'm going to unpack this in more detail and then give some examples. So, what is the necessity operator? How does it work? Well, it works as follows. A sentence of the form necessarily phi is true just in case the proposition expressed by the embedded sentence phi is true at all possible worlds. So when you say phi is necessary, what you're saying is that phi is true at all possible worlds. No matter how things could have been, phi is true. Now, when you say, for the possibility operator, a sentence of the form possibly phi is true just in case the proposition expressed by the embedded sentence phi is true at least one possible world. So when you say phi is possible, what you're saying is there is some possible way things might have been in which phi is true. So now we're going to run a very similar argument to what we just saw above by using these operators and judging the truth value of sentences where we have these operators in play. So first, I want you to consider the following modal sentences. First, necessarily, Aristotle was the last great philosopher of antiquity. And second, necessarily, the last great philosopher of antiquity was the last great philosopher of antiquity. So when we think about the truth of these sentences, what we should realize is that these two sentences differ in truth value. The first is false, whereas the second is true. So this first one here, when I say necessarily, Aristotle was the last great philosopher of antiquity. What I'm saying there is that the way things must be, it has to be, no matter how things could have possibly turned out, Aristotle was the last great philosopher of antiquity. And I think one should realize intuitively that this sentence is false. It is completely possible that Aristotle did not do any philosophy. So there is some possible world in which the embedded sentence 5, Aristotle was the last great philosopher of antiquity, there is some possible world in which is false. So it's not true that the embedded sentence is true at all possible worlds. But now consider the second sentence. Necessarily, the last great philosopher of antiquity was the last great philosopher of antiquity. Now there's a natural reading of this in which it's completely true, that it has to be the case, no matter which possible world you consider, it has to be that the person who was the last great philosopher of antiquity was the last great philosopher of antiquity. So it is a necessary truth, or this sentence, necessarily the last great philosopher of antiquity was the last great philosopher of antiquity, is true. So this sentence and the first one differ in truth value. Now the third step is to know that since the sentences differ in truth value, at our world they have to differ in meaning. And the only way they can do so is if, again, just as in the argument before, the name Aristotle and the definite description, the last great philosopher of antiquity, have different meanings. And again, this suggests that there's no particular definite description which has the same meaning as the name Aristotle. Now, one important upshot of these arguments is a notion of names being rigid. Okay, so Kripke introduced talk of names as rigid designators. So in brief, what these arguments above have shown is that names, proper names, are rigid designators, whereas definite descriptions are not. So what does this mean? Well, here's a definition. So a designator, which is a kind of denoting or referring expression in general, including both proper names and definite descriptions, okay, a designator is rigid just in case it picks out the same individual, regardless of that individual's properties, throughout all the worlds where the sentence containing the designator is being evaluated for truth and falsity. So the idea is that the name Aristotle, whenever you have a sentence containing that name, when you're wondering about the truth value of that sentence in any possible world, the name Aristotle always picks out the same person, regardless of that person's properties at that world. So it's possible that Aristotle, for instance, had none of the properties that he does in our world, but we can still talk about that same person, Aristotle, regardless of whether he had the same properties. And that's why it makes sense to say, for instance, in the modal argument, that it's false that necessarily Aristotle was the last great philosopher of antiquity, because we can imagine a possibility where the name Aristotle picks out this same person, Aristotle, but that person does not have the property of being the last great philosopher of antiquity. So the idea is that proper names refer to their objects in a rigid way. They pick out one and the same object, no matter what different possibilities you're considering. Whereas definite descriptions are not rigid. So the definite description, the last great philosopher of antiquity, as we consider different possible worlds, that description will pick out different people. So in our world, that description picks out Aristotle. But there's another possible way things could have been in which, as I discussed earlier, Aristotle did not get into philosophy. And in that possible world, the last great philosopher of antiquity, that definite description picks out Plato. Or it might have been, for instance, that Aristotle's son became a great philosopher. And in that case, the definite description, the last great philosopher of antiquity, also wouldn't pick out Aristotle, it would pick out his son. So the definite description is not rigid. It picks out different things in different possible worlds. Whereas Aristotle always picks out this one and the same person, no matter what properties that person has in those possible worlds. Now, these two arguments, the modal argument and this one based on intuitions about truth conditions, they involve comparing a name to a particular definite description. So, these two arguments do not show that the cluster theory of names as descriptions is wrong, because the cluster theory rejects Russell's simple view that a name is short for a particular definite description, and says instead that a name is short for a cluster of definite descriptions. To the cluster theory of names as descriptions as well, on a semantic basis, and the way he does so is by arguing that both of the following two sentences, 3 and 4, are false. So as we saw above, an important part of his modal argument was that 3 is false, so necessarily Aristotle is the teacher of Alexander. But furthermore, Kripke claims, the following sentence is also false. Necessarily, Aristotle has some of the following properties: the teacher of Alexander, the student of Plato, the last great philosopher of antiquity, etc. So the idea is that here you can add in all of the elements of this alleged cluster of descriptions, but it'll still be false that necessarily Aristotle has some of those properties. And this goes hand in hand with Kripke's idea that names are rigid designators, whereas descriptions are not. So again, the name Aristotle will pick out the same person in each possible world you're considering, regardless of what properties that person has. So that means that Aristotle doesn't have to have, as a matter of necessity, any of the properties that we think he does. And so that is the semantic argument against both the simple and the cluster theory of proper names as definite descriptions. Now, there's an important rejoinder or response to Kripke's semantic objections to the simple description theory. And the core insight behind this response to Kripke's objections is as follows. It involves noting that some definite descriptions are in fact rigid designators. So philosophers have said that in fact any definite description can be turned into a rigid designator by adding the word actual. So we won't spend too much time on this, but what I just want you to note or consider is the following sentence. 5. Necessarily, the actual teacher of Alexander was the teacher of Alexander. Now, intuitively, this sentence should seem false. So, where 3 is false, right? So necessarily Aristotle is the teacher of Alexander. That's false because Aristotle doesn't have to be the teacher of Alexander, right? And this is in contrast to the sentence. Necessarily, well, I don't have this sentence written down, but what I want you to consider is in contrast with 3, where we say necessarily Aristotle is the teacher of Alexander. That again is false. In contrast, imagine putting the teacher of Alexander in place of Aristotle here. So consider the sentence, necessarily, the teacher of Alexander is the teacher of Alexander. Now that seems to be true. But now, 5, necessarily the actual teacher of Alexander was the teacher of Alexander. That is false, just like 3, and not like the sentence where we said necessarily the teacher of Alexander was the teacher of Alexander. So it seems that if you stick an actual to the definite description, it becomes like a name. So the argument or the response to Kripke's semantic arguments goes that Kripke has not shown that proper names are not disguised, rigid, definite descriptions or actualized definite descriptions. For example, the actual teacher of Alexander. Now, in order to argue against both the simple description theory and the cluster description theory and this possible version of the description theory which we just gave, which talks about rigidified descriptions or actualized descriptions. So as an argument against all of those versions of the description theory, Kripke gives not semantic arguments, but epistemological arguments. So Kripke supplements these semantic arguments about the rigidity of names with epistemological arguments. And these latter arguments are intended to show that that all of these possible versions of the description theory of names are false. And there's two kind of core ideas here, which we'll go through in 1 and 2. First, Kripke notes, you might understand a name without knowing an identifying description which is satisfied by its bearer. So, for example, it might be that all you know about Einstein is that he was a physicist. But that doesn't that does not stop you from understanding the name Einstein. So it seems that people can understand proper names without having any description or a definite description that uniquely picks out the thing that the bearer of the name in mind. So again, you can understand and use the name Einstein without being able to grasp any identifying description at all. Similarly with Aristotle, suppose you were not a philosophy student, you still would have heard of Aristotle, however, you would not have any of the information about him, which I gave, for example, above. But you could still talk about Aristotle. Now, second, it might be that much of the descriptive information, or the most important descriptive information, you associate with the name is wrong. But that does not stop the name from referring to its bearer, and will not stop you from understanding the name. For instance, there's a mathematician, Gödel, and this mathematician in the 20th century proved a very important theorem called Gödel's theorem. And this is basically the extent to which most people have information about Gödel. However, Kripke says, imagine a possibility in which actually Gödel did not prove that theorem. And what he invites you to consider is that someone else who was a part of his department, someone else named Schmidt, actually proved the theorem. And then what Gödel did was he stole the proofs from this other person and then published them as his own. But Kripke says, in that case, the name Gödel still is about Gödel and not this other person, Schmidt. So in this possibility that we're considering, the descriptive information that people have about Gödel is false. It does not pick him out. It picks out instead someone else. However, in this possibility, the name Gödel still refers to or picks out the person Gödel, the same person that we talk about in our world, and not this other person, Schmidt. So what the observation in 1 shows is that we can understand a name without having any identifying descriptions of the bearer. And furthermore, when we do have a bunch of descriptions, it might be that all those descriptions are false of the bearer, but we still are talking about that bearer.